I can, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay. So, hello everybody. We are officially starting now. And before we start with asking questions to Mike, I'm just going to introduce myself and Mike. So, I'm Anna. I am a therapist. I write on Substack here, Neuroscience and Psychotherapy. And today we will talk about brain architecture and evolution, but for therapists, kind of trying to kind of get it to a level that therapists can understand. And why I want to talk about it? Well, I think it's probably self-explanatory when it comes to neuroscience and psychotherapy integration. However, if you're not sure why this is relevant, then just stay and kind of if you listen for a little longer, I'm hoping it will become clear why this is important. And so, who I have here with me to help me with that is a lovely guest, Mike Halassa, who, if you follow me on Substack, you probably know Mike as well, because Mike, pretty much every post you write, I I restock it. And so this is because, really, on Substack at least, this is one of my main kind of go-tos for neuroscience. Mike's Substack is one of the best, if not the best, Substack for neuroscience as far as I'm concerned. And so really it's my go-to. And so to introduce Mike, for those of you who don't know a bit more about him, he is a cognitive neuroscientist and professor of neuroscience in Virginia, right? Tech. And his groundbreaking research has redefined the role of the thalamus in cognition. And he is also a medical doctor and psychiatrist. And I think his clinical focus is mainly schizophrenia and related disorders. And Mike, I think, spends lots of time thinking about brain architecture and brain circuits and how different levels of brain functioning um, are integrated into a whole. And so also Mike is very down to earth. And he's also one of those scientists who are not gatekeeping the knowledge. And I always felt that any kind of curiosity is welcome. And, it doesn't feel that I should keep in my lane and not ask any neuroscience questions. So that was always really, really, really good. And always kind of curiosity is always welcome. And, it is not beneath Mike to actually talk to people who are therapists, as exemplified here. So I can't think of anybody better to ask all my questions about brain architecture and evolution. And so I'll hand over to Mike to, just to see whether I forgot something, or is there anything you want to ask before we start the questions?
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's super generous of you to say all these things, and I appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed our interactions, and I've learned a lot from them. What you and I were talking about this right before we started the live chat, which is that I do have some experience with psychotherapy, having gone through a psychiatry residency, where all of us had to go through our own therapy during that process. So we were exposed to both kind of receiving and administering therapy. So it's something that has stayed with me, and it's something that I constantly think about. So no, our interactions have been great in that regard, and I, to the degree that my background as a neuroscientist is helpful, we should definitely discuss that. And hopefully it'll be helpful to many of the people who are listening in and are on Substack in general.
I'm sure it will. And I will, after this session, I will try to kind of, as always, I do write up a little summary of our conversation. I'll add some references, and, so even if we mention things that you're not sure what we talked about, the important things, I'll put them in summary before I send out the recording. And so let's just kind of dive in with the first question. Before we start with the architecture and evolution, I want to ask you about your view on this following thing. So, as people know, and Mike, I talk a lot about neurobiologics and neuroscience myths, right? And what I noticed in that sphere, there is this other kind of view that's floating, which kind of piggybacks on neurobiologics, a narrative, which is that, well, ultimately, And in therapy and psychology, talking about neuroscience is really not necessary, and there's nothing to be gained from it. Now, obviously, me kind of talking about all the time, I disagree, but I wanted to see, your point of view on this question. So do you think that neuroscience can be useful for therapy?
I think so. I mean, I, uh, uh, there are ways in which one can view people um, um, y- in a manner that neuroscience informs, but it's kind of different than the standard self help ways in which neuroscience is used. So those are kind of two very different um, approaches to utilizing neuroscience in therapy and in other aspects that you know have to do with general life and not necessarily with neuroscience itself. I find it particularly helpful because um, people are really complicated, and as you know, I mean, it's not always clear what motivates people to do various types of things in life. And a lot of times, they do things, we all do things that are either self sabotaging, go against particular types of our interests, and just things that don't make coherent sense. So for me, the value of neuroscience in is trying to make sense of that, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, there are many ways to kind of partition a person, right? You can basically say, okay, well, the person is a particular personality or entity that behaves in a coherent way, and we're trying to put this coherent self back together so that everything makes sense as far as their external behavior is concerned. But if you actually look at the brain is a bunch of different cells that look more like the liver or the heart, or it's not a there is no singular entity that kind of emerges from looking at the brain as a whole. It just looks like a bunch of different parts, which which kind of relates to these theories of the reptilian brain that there are different components that kind of function in their own ways. I don't think that's the way things work, but I do think that there are many subsystems within the brain that may drive behavior in opposing ways that don't look particularly coherent. And part of the human condition is trying to make sense of that. That's that's where I think, and in that, from that particular perspective, neuroscience is helpful in providing a taxonomy of what those subsystems may be. That's kind of my view on what neuroscience could be doing. What are the parts? What are the brain subsystems that drive behavioral strategies? How are those strategies in tension with one another? And how are some strategies coordinated? And how do they ultimately trickle down all the way to the level of neurons and molecules and things like that? That's kind of a physicist perspective on making sense
And
of
in a
really
way,
complex.
you're
Yeah,
right. This does in some ways echo some elements of the lizard brain or triune brain, right? Because you have this kind of opposing forces, but what you're saying is not as simplistic and it's not that one, right? So it's not,
yeah,
we can't say there is kind of the higher functions that kind of drive towards civilized behavior, and there's these lower parts that are the animal in us, and kind of it's the battle between the, right? But we still can simplify in some way, not simplify, but kind of break down, and maybe not yet, as in how much knowledge there is, right? Kind of to break it down in certain systems that will act in ways that sometimes create outcomes in behavior that are not explicable easily or seem like self-sabotage or
yeah.
contradictions, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think at many, many levels of behavior, there people do, you know, uh, um, generate different strategies to deal with the same problem, and those strategies can be in competition with one another. And the job of kind of brain systems is to arbitrate between the. In all of this, there is no central kind of homunculus. that's directing it, which is something that's very, very hard for people to kind of come to terms with. That there is not a single executive sitting in our brain and moving things around, that our behavior is the product of multiple subsystems working in tension and cooperatively. Um, and we can give examples to for that. We don't know what those things are exactly right now, and there are two ways to get at them. One is to come from the top, which is like, think about cognitive science, design cognitive experiments that would expose these types of tensions. And, there are things in, reinforcement learning, for example, where people have thought about model-based kind of value-based decision making and model-free, which are basically two different approaches that roughly map onto high-level strategies versus habits. And, that's a topic that makes sense in therapy. I think breaking habits and things like that. Again, it's not
Yeah.
that simple, right? But that's a level of organization that is a little bit more concrete than what I've been saying. And then there's the bottom up kind of way, which is what relates to brain architecture, right? What we're going to be talking about to some degree, which is the microscopic organization of neurons and circuits and the basic computational elements that they generate, that can then be put together all the way to competing and coordinating systems. Or so
And
that's
what I
kind
want
of
to
how I
say
would think about
here,
it.
just what I want to say, because I use the word bottom up. And I think in therapy, when we think bottom up, we think bottom regulation, meaning through the kind of not cognitive regulation of emotion. But you're not talking about that, right?
No, I'm talking about
So
bottom
it's
up
what
in terms of
in
like,
therapy, when we say bottom up, we think something coming from the body and influencing cognition, or kind of interception would be bottom up. And so you're not talking about that. I just want
no,
to kind
no,
of make sure
not
people
at all. I mean,
understand.
by bottom up, I simply mean, like, if you wanted to understand a car, right? You can just take all the car's pieces and each individual component, understand it individually, and then put it together, and then you have a complete system that can drive.
And so if we think, so, how could you say to the people here, listening to this, what do you do in your work, and in terms of, and how that kind of from the perspective of brain architecture, or what do you do? What are you interested in? What do you research?
Yeah. So
And I know it's really
yeah,
thing to say in a few words in a way, but
yeah. I mean, I try to understand things like attention, short-term memory. The components that are important to put high-level strategies together, and the brain systems that contribute to them. One of the brain systems that I've focused on in my career is the prefrontal cortex, because, if you lesion the prefrontal cortex, then, you get all kinds of issues with high level cognition, strategy, planning, etc. So the approach is really to put the brain in structured tasks, and we administer those tasks to humans, animals, etc., uh, to kind of decode the logic of the prefrontal cortex. And we do that through very precise behavioral measurements, choice behavior, and so on, and which we use to kind of reconstruct the strategy that people or animals may take, and then high resolution neural recordings to kind of listen in on individual neurons while in the frontal cortex and other parts of the brain, in order to infer what the neural code is, what the language of the brain that is used to construct these strategies. That's kind of what I do. Um, and the prefrontal cortex has an interesting architectural property, in that it's, the neurons are super heavily connected to one another, and that allows them to kind of keep information in mind over a long period of time that's independent of any inputs. And that's a really important kind of characteristic that allows the brain to disengage from the immediate environment and deliberate over its own internal content. So the PFC is one brain area that has the architecture to do that. Um, and then the other thing is, and that's kind of relates to the literature that I think you're interested in, which is attractor dynamics, which is like keeping bumps of activity, in mind to deliberate over them and do inference and all kinds of planning. So that's one thing that is important in terms of its architecture. And the other thing is that it has projections to all other parts of the brain to exert kind of what we call top-down control. So, for example, if I'm in a party with it's called the cocktail party problem. If I'm in a party with a bunch of different conversations going on, what I can do is that without even moving my head or doing anything, I can kind of listen in to these conversations with my mind's ear. For example, I can move my internal spotlight of attention to different conversations without moving a muscle. And we think that that's in part because of this top-down control from the prefrontal cortex. So that strategy of which uh, um, conversation to listen in on is loaded up in the prefrontal cortex. And by projecting back to the auditory areas, it can highlight the conversation that we care about and suppress the ones that we don't. So that's kind of generally the architectural features of that part of the brain that are relevant for, something as complicated as solving the cocktail party problem.
And I think, maybe for people who are learning this cocktail party problem that you describe, I think in mindfulness or even in kind of therapy that includes some mindfulness, there is that thing where if you focus on the body, you start perceiving and feeling your body more, right? If
Yeah.
you say to yourself, for example, if at the moment I'm not feeling my pinky at all, but if I say to myself, I want to feel what my pinky is feeling, all of a sudden I'm going to start having much more sensations in one of the fingers or the feet. Or in mindfulness, it's a classic thing where kind of the body scan or body attention training. And so that would be a similar process, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Only applied to the extent.
It's applied to a different sense. And one, I guess one of the insights that I have gotten through studying, these kind of tasks in animals is that knowledge in all of us can be latent and stored in various parts of the brain. We're still trying to figure out how that works as a field. We don't have a very good theory of memory, but it's clear that we can have latent knowledge, long-term memory stored in our parts of the memory, different parts of the brain. But ultimately, for those memories to guide actions, they constantly have to be loaded up in the frontal cortex, right? I mean, that's an insight that's not very obvious, right? It's not particularly clear that every time you have to perform a task in life, um, there are systems that exist in order to load up a strategy into your frontal cortex, and that's kind of when you're on and you're trying to solve that particular problem.
Consciously.
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. I
This
think
is sorry, everybody. This is kind of going away from architecture, but it's really interesting. So I couldn't resist asking you.
yeah, maybe so okay. I got interested in neuroscience in the first place because I really wanted to study consciousness, and then I realized it's just not the kind of problem that lends itself to objective measurements the way attention or other types of cognitive operations are. So I don't study consciousness because I think it's just too difficult, and I'm not exactly sure what it is or how to study it or how to be sure that we're studying.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is like I think this is a language problem because when I say consciously, not as in consciousness, but as in therapy, there is like explicit and implicit
Yeah, yeah,
memory,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, but it
And
does
so when I
relate. Yeah, yeah.
it's within with awareness. And
Yeah,
when
yeah,
you
yeah.
say something has to be loaded in the prefrontal cortex, it's because I'm guessing, like let's say fear conditioning, right? Or threat conditioning does not have to kind of go, from what I understand from research, it does not have to go through any awareness at all to have a reaction in the body.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, yes. I think that there are many, high level complex strategies that don't require any, awareness or conscious appraisal. And I think that usually what people refer to these things, and I think that's true in therapy, is that whether you have the metacognitive capacity to do the appraisal on the things that you're doing, whether you can evaluate your own actions in a way that's kind of metacognitive. That's the general idea. And
I
metacognitive
mean,
capacity.
this is there is so much to be said about that, and it's another rabbit hole because you could then say, "Oh, what about habitual learning and things like that?" But let's not go there.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go back to architecture and ask you: can you describe for us what is that actually? When you say
yeah,
brain
yeah,
architecture in your work,
yeah.
what do you mean by that?
So there are many scales at which the brain can be studied. Maybe you can pull up the 3D model of the brain. So just that it's obvious. So
There we
um,
go.
yeah, I
We're
mean,
good on brain.
yeah. So that's a macro level of architecture that the brain has a particular form. There's an outer folded structure that we call the cerebral cortex, and there are different components. There's the cerebellum in the back of the brain. There's the thalamus and the basal ganglia in the middle. There's there's the
Thalamus
brain.
is here, right?
Yeah, yeah,
On
yeah,
this side,
yeah, yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, all these things are, what we consider the macro architecture of the brain. The brain has a particular form that we can see with our naked eyes. Um, so,
Yeah,
so
okay,
that,
so it's a form of architecture, it's macro architecture, right?
yeah,
So that would
that's
be basically brain anatomy.
yeah, and those colors are roughly informed by Brodmann's areas. This is a particular classification from the late 19th and early 20th century, which attributes particular type of meso or microarchitectural features to these areas. So if you look with a microscope and look at how dense the cells are in different parts of the cortex, for example, you'll see that they kind of vary, and those kind of inform these divisions that are mesoscopic, right? That's kind of at a middle level type of scale. And then if you go all the way down to the level of individual cells and how they're connected to one another, that's the microarchitecture that kind of a lot of modern neuroscience focuses on. What are circuits? How are
So
they connected? Yeah, go ahead.
so so it's cells, types of cells, and how they're connected, right?
Yeah, I mean, the motivation ultimately is not to kind of um, just have a parts list, but be able to put that parts list together in as it serves a particular function, right? So when we say the prefrontal microcircuits work in a particular way, what we're curious about is how do they keep information about different things in mind, right, to be able to act on it. So how do you put circuits together that fulfill a function? Um, and we can talk about examples of this. So I'll give you kind of a broad example that will make a little bit more sense.
For the
If you look at
circuit, for the circuit,
yes, for the
for the
circuit,
circuit.
yeah,
And please define circuit first, because it kind of, to me, when I hear circuit, I think, electrical circuit. Something starts here and goes there and goes back and comes back. So, what is for you neural circuit? How do you define that?
it's a group of cells with an internal wiring diagram that performs some input output operation. That's kind of what it is. So and by an input output defined that way is what a computation is, right? So you put something in and you get an output that classifies that input, for example, transforms it into a different format that is more kind of easier to act on for the next region and so on. Like, for example, if you take vision, right, uh, the first um, station of vision is the retina. And you can think of the retina as a group of pixels that go on and off the way your TV is, for example. But when you look at the world, that's not what you see. What you see are the world immediately appears as a bunch of different objects in visual space, right? Going from pixels to a bunch of objects in visual space requires a huge amount of hardware that we all have, right? And it's a station of different brain regions that perform input output kind of operations, computations that take you from the world of pixels to the world of objects, right? That's the that's the easiest way to describe it. Uh, uh, and all of
So
these,
you're
yeah,
using using vision as an example. Is this because vision is one of those systems that is well studied and understood?
yes, vision is probably the best, and that's a great point. Vision is the best studied system in the brain, and we know a lot about it because we were very visual beings, and yeah, neuroscience has focused on vision, so we know a lot about it. But yeah,
Is it because it was easier to understand and tackle, or is it because it was random? As in, kind of, it seems to me that we know much more about vision or some other things than, let's say, emotions.
um, well, I mean, vision is a sensory system, so experimentally, it's just a lot easier to study because you can simply give your subject visual input and measure responses in the brain. And there's ground truth, what you showed them, and the responses that you have to interpret. So that kind of mapping is a lot easier as opposed to
Yeah,
emotion. I
it's
mean,
it is
yeah.
maybe also between animals and humans there is more similarities between vision system than emotional systems in some ways.
Well, I mean, there's not really a way to deliver emotional stimuli. You're still delivering sensory inputs, and then interpreting what the response to them from an emotional type of perspective. There's not a way to have emotional inputs that are not sensory.
Yeah, and there is no way to actually know what somebody's feeling without asking them, and animals can't talk, right?
Yeah, I mean, emotions have the same problem as consciousness in that particular domain because there's no ground truth that in the same way that sensory inputs have ground truth.
Mm.
So it just
Yeah, yeah.
makes it
So
harder
in
to
a way
study. Yeah.
easier to study in some ways. And so so yeah, you were talking about circuits, and so how I understand it is basically a circuit would be a set of cells that would, from one input, there is a kind of a defined path that
Yeah.
gives a certain defined output, and and they could be, I'm assuming, small or bigger or longer, right?
Yeah. I mean, the level at which we define a circuit in a standard type of systems neuroscience way is that we measure responses from the brain, and now we have the capacity to be able to tell different components um, apart. We can measure responses from excitatory neurons versus different types of inhibitory neurons, and then we can see, um, how those vary with different task conditions, different sensory inputs, etc. So then we can basically go back and try to come up with a description in circuit form as to what those components are doing. That's basically what the idea of a circuit is, at least defined from that functional perspective.
And so what you study will be kind of that level of detail of this. Can you call it connectivity? Is that connectivity as well, or no? Or
Um,
of
yeah, I mean, so the connectivity within a circuit is our way to summarize or have our working hypothesis about what that component of the nervous system is doing. So yes, those are connectivity kind of uh, uh, motifs, right? That summarize how we think,
mm.
um, that uh, building block of frontal cortex, visual cortex, different parts of the visual system are working. So, just to give you like an example of what architecture is from that perspective, you can
Mhm.
say if you look at any part of cortex, it's composed of 6 layers, different. These are dominated by excitatory neurons, so you can construct flow patterns between them, and that's your wiring diagram at that level. And then about 15% or so of the cells are inhibitory neurons, so those are important for gating the activity flow in that wiring diagram. Different cortical areas have different proportions, different types of connectivity patterns that give them an input output from other areas that gives them their particular function. And then you go into subcortical systems, for example, and you find very different types of wiring patterns, right? The thalamus, the area that, you know, I study in conjunction with frontal cortical function is very different. It's non-recurrent, meaning that it's feed forward. It's all the neurons don't talk to each other. So you have, a entire brain system that have neurons sitting next to one another, but don't talk to each other, not directly at least. Um, and their function is defined by inputs from outside and their impact on their targets. Basal ganglia, for example, which is kind of involved in Parkinson's and habits and things like that, are completely composed of inhibitory neurons. So the way we think about their function is, you know, related to gating and so on. And then outside of these architectural kind of divisions in the brain, you have neuromodulators, which are, I think, very highly relevant to psychiatry and psychotherapy, which are things like dopamine, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, etc., which come from subcortical areas and kind of modify the operating regime of cortex, basal ganglia, and thalamus, and so on. So that's roughly, you
So,
know, yeah,
so just one question here. First of all, I just want to say for people, so you were talking about this forward network or loops and kind of recurring network as prefrontal cortex, right?
yeah,
And um, for those who are interested, there is a blog or Substack post we've written together a while ago. So you can go and have a look. There's like a picture where we explain, well, Mike explains a bit better what it is if you're interested. Second thing I want to address, that there's Kathy asking something that's really interesting. And Kathy, I'm so sorry. I don't think we're going to have time to get into this, but we will eventually. So Kathy's asking, I'm curious about how predictive coding fits into this conversation. And it's a very relevant question, right, Mike? I
yeah.
just don't know if it's a whole different conversation, and I'm hoping that one day soon we'll have a blog post together on this specific topic.
No, but
But
I can,
it's
but I
a
can
relevant.
say a few things about that. I mean,
Yep.
if you, the predictive processing um, kind of enterprise, I will call it, concerns with how the cortex operates mostly. So, there's the idea that let's just talk about vision because we started off with vision and the transformation from the world of pixels to the world of object. There's many intermediate stations in that. And the world doesn't always come in a very clear format, right? Like objects are not particularly clear under different lighting conditions or fog or whatever, right? So, but we don't really like once you get a little bit of water in your eye or the world is foggy or whatever, the world doesn't fall apart. And part of what we why we think that is the case is because the cortex is an inference machinery or a predictive machinery, meaning that the information is sent to many areas of the cortex at the same time. It's not strictly feed forward in that way. And different areas, because they have recurrent connectivity, have their own generative models of the world, right? Like different areas kind of, have a guess about what is out there. And the higher areas are the ones that make an inference at the high level of objects. And once they do that, they send top down signals to lower areas to shape their responses. And that's part of the inference machinery. So what happens is that you get the input uh, and you process it in different areas. Each area makes its own kind of guess about what's out there, and the top areas project to the bottom areas in an iterative way so that you can converge on what's out there through multiple areas working together. That there are specific kind of ways in which some people think about this, which is like the bottom up input or the sensory input is canceled out when you can predict the world. It's not clear that that's how things work, and there are different details about exactly how predictive kind of algorithms are implemented in the brain, but they have to do with cortex, its architecture, and the interaction between different areas in the context of inference. I hope that was clear.
So yeah, and I think it is obviously there is, we talked about this. There is predictive processing or active inference, which is a specific model of how that might work, right? Or there could be alternative ways, and so I think there is maybe there might be debate about that. But that's, I think this is within this context. I think you made the link now. So I just want to go back really to the nitty gritty. So you said about these 6 layers in the cortex. Is it 6? Yeah. So is this what you call lamination?
Yeah, that's the laminar structure of cortex. Yeah.
So this is the lemon. And so I know this is, sorry to be so kind of particular about this, but what that means is that these cells are like really kind of coming after the other in 6 layers, and they're kind of, the information is traveling from one layer to another. Is that what it means?
There are there are ways in which um so it's not that there's one way for the information to travel through there are multiple different kind of information streams within the cortex, but the layers do provide general guidelines of how to think about them. But it's an
And
area of
so,
debate too. I mean,
and
I
so,
remember, yeah.
say again. Sorry,
No,
say again.
I remember like maybe it was 5 years ago that there was this meeting in which I participated in, and the meeting invited a bunch of people to talk about cortical layers. And at the end, I think everybody left just debating whether layers had any functions at all. Uh,
That's crazy
yeah.
because this is one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you, because the whole kind of edifice or of theory of constructed emotions is kind of standing on this idea that the cortex has this the granularity, and that granularity is kind of increasingly lost as you kind of go deeper and deeper, right? From what I understand, other cortical areas, insula or cingulate cortex, are kind of maybe in between. And then when we go into kind of subcortical areas, it's agranular. I don't know how they call it. And that will be kind of, that is the linchpin in the whole kind of idea of this theory, that they kind of have different functions as a result of this cellular structure, right? So is that so? Can you? So first of all, I guess, so this is the case. So in the cortex, or at least some parts of the cortex, right? There is this 6 layers structure, and then that's gradually lost. Is that the case?
Well, so the 6-layer structure describes areas that we call neocortex. Um, and for example, motor cortex has 5 layers. It doesn't have a layer 4. Um, Whatever. I mean, these are details, but most of the outer part of our brains is neocortex. What there's archicortex and paleocortex, and those are describing things that are that lack that granular layer 4, for example. Like uh motor cortex is agranular, doesn't have that layer, and there are parts of the prefrontal cortex that don't really have a clear layer 4, maybe, so we call them disgranular. So those are all of this granular, disgranular, agranular describe parts of the neocortex. And then you have archae and paleocortex. Those describe things like the insula and the hippocampus, for example. Hippocampus is kind of a cortical structure. Um, so that's that. Now, if you go to subcortical areas like the thalamus and the basal ganglia, those just have completely different architecture. They don't have layers. They don't have any of these things. They have their own kind of parts lists that are just very, very different from cortex.
And so you wouldn't call that agranular. You would just call it different.
Yeah, I mean, it's just Yeah, that terminology does not apply to subcortical structures.
And so what you're saying, so you mentioned that, and I think this is like a really nice segue into evolution a little
Yes,
bit, right?
yes,
To
yes.
mention that.
Yeah.
But I just want to say is that what you're saying is that even on that level, we're not sure, because you mentioned you were in a conference or a meeting where people were debating whether actually these layers do have a specific function as such. And
Yes.
so uh, and so does this the difference between this, so clearly there is difference in these kind of subcortical areas and these different granularities in the cortex. And so would you say that, there is something then different, fundamentally different between these areas and what they do in their function as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, what's cool about the cortex is that it seems like there is this six layer, or there is this canonical cortical circuit. That's kind of like, if people are interested, they can go look it up online and just type in Google canonical cortical circuit, and they're going to see, information flowing from outside to layer 4, goes to layer, 5, 6, goes back to upper layers, and so on. And there's like a specific, and then there's another pathway that goes to superficial layer, and so on. So there are these, activity flow patterns based on that canonical circuit. Now, what people tend to think is that this thing is taken and modified in different ways in different areas to fit their function, right? The specific connectivity within that six layer architecture. Some layers are gone in some areas, and so on. But there is this canonical circuit that's modified in different areas, fit to particular functions. That's the idea. Evolutionarily speaking, if you look back, if you look at organisms that exist now that may resemble past forms more so than us, you look at the turtle, for example. There's a part of the brain called the pallium, which we think is most cortical-like, that has a three-layer cortex, for example. Right?
So
That's
is
the
it a cortex then? Is it a cortex or no?
I think people who study turtles call it cortex.
Hmm.
Right? So I don't study turtles, so I don't know. But it looks like it has kind of sensory responses the way we tend to think about the cortex. It looks like it can hold activity patterns. So it looks like it can be a jack of all trades, right? It does things that the cortex does, a little bit of what the hippocampus does. So it's a multi-purpose primordial cortical precursor.
So that's interesting. So you're talking also a turtle, right? And so this, what you're saying is what they have as a cortex,
Yeah.
this tail it's in a way very different from our cortex, as you're saying. So what did you say? So it could be doing the cortex, or it could be doing also hippocampus. Is that what you said?
Right. Yeah. It has features of both.
And so in a way, we can see that there is this kind of two organisms, right? Humans and turtle that all live today, and their brains are not necessarily on the top of each other,
No,
right?
no, 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 no. I mean, I'll give you another example. If you compare the visual system of rodents and the visual system of primates, uh, what you would see is that the visual, what we call primary visual cortex in a mouse, for example, looks a lot more like higher level visual cortex in people than really what we think the primary visual cortex is. So primary
Wait,
visual,
say again.
yeah,
I have to say this again. It's too much for my brain. It's too much for my prefrontal cortex to hold. You have to say it again, please. Sorry. So
yeah,
you have rodents, yeah?
yeah. You have okay. When information travels from the retina, it goes to the visual thalamus, an area called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then goes to the cortex. The first station in cortex, where we start seeing responses to visual form, are is called primary visual cortex. That exists in the mouse. That exists in the human. In humans, the um, the responses are very sharp and are organized, in a way that supports high resolution vision that rodents don't have. But the key idea here is that uh, uh, the primary visual cortex of rodents looks a lot more like a multi-purpose visual area that started to be elaborated in humans, right? And in primates, and be split into things that even the primary visual cortex of it, you know, e- even the back, like the inputs to our high resolution vision or form vision is a later elaboration of evolution than things being built on kind of a less precise visual system. Does that make sense?
So let me just I'll just rephrase it to see if I listen correctly. So what you're saying is that in rodents, this layer, that's the first layer, will kind of have a more precision than what kind of in humans that kind of needs processing to that get to that level of precision in
Yes,
vision.
yes. Well,
So
no,
what
no, no. I mean, the first layer of the first layer in rodents can do, kind of more, you know, higher level processing than our first area. Our
and
first area can do a lot less higher level processing than that
Yeah,
in the
so
rodent.
the point you were making in terms of evolution is that that in the end of the day, for that specific trait or the specific thing in rodents, that is more highly evolved, or what do you want to say in terms of evolution? Is that the point you're making?
Things are not built on an on an evolutionary blueprint in this way of just stacking additional functions. That you don't have a primary visual cortex that can do a lot of things, and then you build on top of it. You can sometimes build behind it or lower than it.
Yeah,
Does
yeah.
that
So,
make
so,
sense?
so,
And yeah,
so that it's not unidirectional, the evolution,
yes,
as in kind
yes.
of the one species more evolved, and I think it's called the ladder of nature. That idea that the evolution acts by adding layers.
Yeah, so the visual system is a good example of creating lower levels further in evolution.
Mm. Yeah, so I understand. Yeah, and hopefully people do understand. And so, let me ask you about evolution a little bit more. So, is our brain coming from lizards? What do you think
No,
about that?
no, no, no. Our brains are not, I mean, that's a good example, right? Like our brain is evolved in a particular way to adapt to our own environmental needs. Um, Lizards have their own adaptations to serve their own purposes. So I think just generally this idea that there's a lizard brain with stuff stacked on top of it is not a helpful way to think about our brains at all.
And as I obviously actually interesting a little anecdote. Mike, me and you met through the lizard brain, so it's
Yeah,
not all
that's right.
bad.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not
I
all
was.
bad. And probably the best thing that lizard brain has ever done is that I met Mike Halassa. Lizard brain has contributed to the world. Hell, thank you,
Yeah,
lizard brain. But
maybe.
because of that, I do get, every now and then messages from people who are therapists and say, well, I know that, of course, it's oversimplification, but ultimately, is it not a good approximation of how the brain works? And is it not being really pedantic to kind of say, oh, you can't kind of use that in therapy, you shouldn't use it in therapy? So why would you say it's not really a good approximation of how brain works for even somebody who's like a therapist?
Well, because emotions are kind of interwoven in every aspect of cognition, right? I mean, emotion is not like this thing that's added on. So I think it's not helpful because it relegates emotional processing to a lower level type of function, with cognition sitting on top and regulating it. And that's just not how the brain works at all. Emotions and the regulation of bodily function and regulation of um, um, everything that we associate with emotional processing is interwoven to the very nature of what the brain is for.
And
And
so,
yeah,
yeah. it wouldn't be the kind of, I think what you're describing there is that typical idea that, there is the kind of prefrontal cortex is this executive adult who is trying to tame the child. That's the limbic system or the amygdala or whatever. And so that's not how it is, right?
No, I mean, it's not only that. I mean, the reflexive behavior doesn't have to be emotional either. There's plenty of reflexive behavior that's stimulus response kind of behavior.
That's a good
That
point. Yeah, that's a good
that that
point.
that that doesn't have to be emotional at all. Sensory motor processing, a lot of it is neither cognitive nor emotional. So and people, I mean, I think that a lot of human society is based on the on how well people can read each other's emotions and infer their emotional state. So it's a very cognitive type of. I mean, it's very cognitive like in that way, and I think trying to. I mean, maybe the therapy of the future is about treating emotions in a way that they're high level functions, just like cognition, not relegating them to something that needs to be
I mean, I
regulated.
think really, I mean, I love you said that you said this way better than I ever could, but this is really, I think, a contradiction that's embedded in the whole thing of the lizard brain. As therapists, we all understand the importance of emotions, not only as this like crazy thing that happens and makes us dysregulated, but emotion is the core of humanity, right? As you say, all communication is partly based on emotional reading and all sorts of things, right? And so to say that that's some lower parts of the brain is really in some way deprecating to emotion, which is really important, right?
Yeah, and I would tend to. I mean, we can take again the example of vision, starting off with pixels and ending up with objects, right? Which is a very kind of complicated series of computations that get you there. I think that emotions are kind of that too, to something. There are ways to think about emotions in that way, which is inferring, which we actually do um, automatically. Like when we look at, there's a whole story. Maybe we'll have a follow up on this, but when we look at the world, at the social world, right? Like when you're not driving and just trying to figure out where to go, but when you enter into a new environment with a bunch of people around, you're not only inferring that there are people there as visual objects, you're also automatically segmenting the environment into emotional type maps, right? Which is really good for figuring out who to engage, right? You go into a new party, you don't know anybody, you're automatically processing, kind of creating an emotional map that matches your own temperament as to where the next action should be. Who should you talk to next?
And I
That's
think I
a
think really
very, yeah.
this is for, because we only have a 5 minutes left, so this is really for a follow-up, but this also really connects with that idea of, I wanted to ask you about, is the kind of the prefrontal cortex being, the thing that human defines humans, right? And you mentioned how even entering in a social situation, we are automatically doing calculations. Ultimately, we don't
Yes,
call it
yeah.
calculations, in therapy we wouldn't call it, but it is a calculation. Who is friend, who is not friend, who is friendly, who is likely to like me, who is likely to reject me, and all that is actually happening somewhere in the brain. And I think, I mean, you'll know better than me, but I think part of that is one of the biggest expansions of the cortex in humans, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
so the
yeah,
brain that does
yeah.
those calculations. Where is that?
Everywhere. Everywhere. I mean, it's this is the again, the prefrontal cortex probably has a very specific and the prefrontal cortex in the human is like half of the brain, right? It has so many different areas that do different things. So that's a whole other topic for a different day.
Okay.
But a lot of areas are influenced by this kind of emotional partitioning. And in order for that to work, you have to have also good vision, good hearing, good things like that. But all of these areas are probably influenced by emotional state and the goal of who to engage. So
And and
yeah,
I think, the kind of hearing what you say there, the message is that things are complicated, and, as much as we would like to make them really simple, oh, well, thinking is here and feeling is here, and, you when you're stressed, you are disconnecting the prefrontal cortex and only the amygdala is working. It's just not how things work, right? And so, that's why we shouldn't use those things when we think about neuroscience and therapy, because they just are not how things work, I would say.
yeah. I mean, my take on neuroscience and therapy is, for people to make up their own minds about that. But maybe, when you hear a neuroscientific explanation of a phenomenon, you could simply ask, is it adding value to that explanation, or is it just reframing it in a sort of a more complicated way that doesn't really add value? It's a very hard thing to do, but it's hopefully what we're kind of talking about and aspiring to help people.
Yeah, the thing is that that's a, it's a very, what you said there, it's kind of double-edged sword, right? And I don't know who is putting all these little hearts for us, but thank you so much. We appreciate it. We love hearts. Please do hearts. And so what I want to say is that what you said there, yeah, that's true. But having said that, if you have a neurobolic stuff, right, that it can add value to, even if it's wrong, it can add value because it makes you more confident in what you say. And as a therapist, that's a thing that's kind of known as a therapist. If you are really confident in your model and you think you know what you're talking about, you project that confidence on the client.
Yeah,
And client all of a sudden feels, well, he or she knows what they're talking about. I'm just going to go along with that. And so in a way, you could argue, and people have argued. I had an interesting conversation on Substack with somebody who has written, who are we to tell somebody this is neurobolox? Because if that's providing to the client some kind of certainty, some level of knowing how things work, even if it's wrong, why would we disillusion them? In the same way you could say about astrology, right? Some people love astrology. They feel that gives them a sense and a system about how things work. Who are you to tell us that's not, how it works? Why would we listen to you? And so what I'm saying
yeah.
is that sometimes theories, even if they're not true, they add value because they give
I
us
think I think it depends on what I mean. What I meant by value is explanatory values,
the true
value.
value as an
And
explanation.
as a scientist, I do think that there's an objective truth out there that it's not a matter of debate what that is, right? Like, you know, people, there exists something that we can objectively measure and agree upon as the truth. And if we don't have that, um, then the world is very different than what many of us think it is.
So
So
Mike, you're not
yeah,
you're not you're not postmodernist.
I'm not. I'm not. I'm a scientist,
Okay.
and I think part of my job is to kind of get as close to what objective truth is in the different areas that I'm concerned with. Yeah. So yeah.
And so we're really close to ending now. I just want to ask you, if you were to give us therapists or people who are watching, which I assume are the therapists or people who are interested in the workings of the mind, what would be maybe three things to kind of three things we should know and understand about brain architecture and evolution that as a kind of foundation of our thinking about how to think about neuroscience and therapy, what would you say? What could you choose out of things we discussed?
Yeah. I would say number one, people are not single entities, they're a coalition of systems. And one way I find very helpful when looking at, when trying to treat somebody is to understand that I am treating a coalition of systems, not not a single entity, which allows me to kind of make sense better of their behavior. And even when I talk to them, I'm trying to explain that to them so that they're not they're not discouraged or confused every time they generate a behavior that's self-sabotaging, right? So I think that's one. Two is that we don't exactly know what the form of this coalition is. It's something that we're working on, and for people not to fall to traps such as the lizard brain, as a way to explain like a three-level coalition with emotions at the bottom and cognition at the top, right? And um, three is that I think the future is super bright. I think that we are heading into a world in which, yes, there are many things to be worried about and uncertainties and stuff like that, but we are at the in part of human history that is unique, and we all have the opportunity to shape it in ways that are helpful to all of us. And I think the world is a lot kinder and a lot more compassionate and a lot more exciting than it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever. And I think
Or
therapy
then
has.
and or then what sometimes it might appear on social media.
Yes, and therapists have a huge kind of role in shaping that future, and I'm excited to see it. And that's
Oh,
part of the reason why
and
collaborating with you is. Yeah.
thank you so much for being a scientist who actually considers that therapists are somebody to talk to. Not many are like that. So I really appreciate that. I think the people who were watching and my readers appreciate that. And thank you everybody for all these big hearts. Heart back to you. Back. And so thank you, Mike. I know if you want to say anything else, I want to thank you and thank everybody who's been here. And sorry we didn't kind of have a chance to answer too many questions, but I don't think there was too many questions. And I'll probably invite you some other time. But say if you want to say something to our people who are watching.
Yeah, thank you for showing up, and there's more to come, hopefully, and Anna and I continue to collaborate on many projects, so there will be more.
Yeah, you will be the judges of everything,
Yeah.
everything that we do. Okay, thank you so much, guys, and see you soon. Bye bye.
Bye.